Externalities are what we refer to when we talk about the social and economic effects markets have outside the market itself, so those who aren't economically active within a given market. So we define an externality as something a bit like this: the effect of one actor's economic activity on another actor's well-being, where this activity is not accounted for by the price system. So be careful to recognise this distinction in the second half of the definition, just between outside and inside of a market setting. So just because I buy something that's the last in stock before you get the chance, although your well-being is reduced by my activity, this doesn't constitute an externality. It occurs within a market setting, so it's a distributional question. Examples like this may occasionally be referred to as a pecuniary externality, but what's generally meant by the term are technological externalities, and that's what we want to focus on. So instead, classic examples of externalities include the effects of secondhand smoke, firms that pollute and toxify the environment, airports or other noisy infrastructure built near residential areas. But they can crop up in any number of contexts. So think about the external effect on individual body image that the fashion industry is always said to have. That's less quantifiable and not entirely external, but arguably a lot more socially relevant than some of the classic examples we might find. Externalities might be positive too. So think about how if your neighbour spends a fortune on fireworks for bonfire night, you might get a spectacular show that's completely free for you. It costs nothing for you, and it wasn't in your neighbour's interest to entertain you, but if the good is non-exclusive like that, then you still benefit. Suppose you're a kid back at school. If in winter the bus services don't run because the roads are dangerous, then you might well get a day off school. Now, for most school children, that's about the best thing that can happen to you on a Monday, but your agency was totally irrelevant. The bus company made an economic decision that the risk of running services that day were too great, and entirely by coincidence, you've come out with the greatest benefit out of everyone. So our definition above refers pretty broadly to an economic actor. So in the fireworks example, it's an individual who makes an economic decision that positively affects another individual. In the day off school example, it's a firm's self-regarding decision that results in a positive outcome, again for an individual. The example that I want to focus on involves externalities between two firms. So externalities can be the product of two individuals, two firms, or one of each, but what's important to respect here is the reciprocal nature of the externality. So the way we've looked at these scenarios up to now implies a one-sided interaction, one actor making a decision that affects another actor who in turn has absolutely no control over the outcome. But in reality, if you're the child with a day off school, then your parents chose to send you to a school that you have to bus to. So they could have expected that you'd have the odd day off in November. Your neighbour may not have sent up any fireworks for your sake, but you did choose him as a neighbour, in a sense, at some point. And you may well have chosen not to make any other plans that night. So, to some extent, you made that choice. The same applies with negative externalities. Secondhand smoke might be an annoyance and a health hazard, but to different degrees. You can't complain if you chose to sit in the smoky area of a pub or live with 5 people that smoke. This isn't the same as saying that those affected are necessarily responsible in any normative sense. We're not assigning blame, saying that such people made their beds and that what happens to them is just fair game. Those are judgments of distribution and fairness, not of economics per se. It's simply that to understand the problem correctly, we have to recognise some degree of agency on the part of both the actors, even if their actions were predicated on little or no information. If we do that, then we can begin to understand how they might cooperatively attempt to find a resolution. So the classic example of an externality involving two firms is that of an eyeglass manufacturer and a charcoal factory. So this is a real-life example with precedent in 19th century English law. Suppose the eyeglass factory is located downwind of the charcoal firm, and as a result, charcoal dust in the air seeps into the production process for the eyeglass firm and damages the precision grinding machines that they use to manufacture eyeglasses. And this reduces the quality or quantity of what they produce, and consequently output drops. So if we look at the parameters in this case, we have two firms. and they're competing for the exclusive resource here, which is air. The externality is mutually negative, so charcoal production cannot be increased without diminishing eyeglass production and vice versa. We also assume that air is infinitely divisible and that the charcoal firm is a price taker, which makes sense given charcoal is a pretty homogeneous good. This last assumption means that we might model cost and social cost like this. So in a perfectly competitive market, equilibrium price is given along a horizontal line, and that represents our demand curve. The other two curves we see here represent private marginal cost, MC, and social marginal cost, MSC. At this point, we might do well to clarify some of our terminology. So, marginal cost, MC, is just like in any other microeconomic model, the sum of all the input costs that the charcoal firm undertakes to produce one additional unit of charcoal. So, labour, raw materials, capital, etc. Social marginal cost is the firm's private marginal cost. So all of these, plus the cost that the firm inflicts arbitrarily on the eyeglass firm in terms of diminished output. So in short, it's the sum of all the costs to both the injured and the polluting parties. So going back to our graph, at equilibrium quantity, the vertical distance between points B and D represent the cost to the eyeglass firm. The vertical distance between points D and equilibrium quantity represent the cost to the charcoal firm. And predictably, the sum of both of them together, the distance between points B and equilibrium quantity represent the total cost to all of the parties, the social marginal cost. Point A illustrates where we might find an efficient resource allocation, where social marginal cost is equal to equilibrium price. In an ideal world, we would probably want them to share. So the charcoal firm would reduce its output to Q prime, allowing them to share the air. Social marginal cost, the cost to all parties, would be equal to price in such an instance. Unfortunately, conventional economic theory tells us that the charcoal firm will produce until price is equal to its private marginal cost, MC, and that's at point D. But Ronald Coase demonstrated that the socially efficient allocation at point A might be achieved through bargaining between the parties, without any intervention or manipulation of the market, subject to the right conditions. On the surface, it might seem apparent that the firm with property rights to the resource in question, air in this case, will simply just use that resource in such a way as to produce at its own equilibrium price and quantity with no regard for any other actors or firms. That is what's in keeping, after all, with the assumptions of a self-interested, profit-maximising firm. But if we assume that the parties are capable of bargaining, then this might not be the case. So, suppose one firm offers the other, the firm with the rights to use the air, compensation in return for usage of some of that air. The two key concepts here are property rights and opportunity cost. So let's suppose, first of all, that the charcoal firm holds the rights to use the air. The cost of using the air, which it has exclusive control over, is equal to the amount that another, say a local eyeglass firm, is prepared to pay to use the air alternatively, the opportunity cost. The amount the eyeglass firm is prepared to pay is exactly equal to the external damage done by charcoal pollution to their production. They'll pay to offset that damage, but if that in itself costs more than the damage done, then it's not worth it to them, so they won't. So if the cost of using the air for the charcoal firm is equal to the opportunity cost of selling it, and the opportunity cost of selling it is equal to the damage done by air pollution, then the damage done by air pollution is in turn equal to the cost of using the air. If you recall though, that external damage done by air pollution is already on our graph as the distance between points B and D. So if we're confident that that vertical distance represents the cost of the charcoal firm using the air, because they could instead profit by selling it to the eyeglass firm, then logically it must be part of the charcoal firm's total cost function. And if it recognises this, the firm will take the MSC curve, which contains both the external damage of charcoal pollution and the input costs of production, to be its true marginal cost curve. So MSC is the charcoal firm's marginal cost now. Like any other, marginal cost must equal price to maximise profit in this model. So the firm will sell some of the rights to use the air and reduce output to Q prime accordingly. We can observe the same effect if we now suppose the eyeglass firm holds the rights to the air. If the charcoal firm offers compensation to the eyeglass firm to offset the losses incurred by the presence of charcoal dust in their production process, in other words, buy the air to pollute, then the eyeglass firm will agree to this deal up until the cost of that compensation is equal to the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of eyeglasses instead. To find equilibrium, we have to know how much one firm is prepared to pay and how much the other is prepared to reduce its output. So the charcoal firm, first of all, will be prepared to pay up to its total profits to pollute the air, which we understand by price minus marginal cost. And this is an arrangement that the eyeglass firm will consent to, provided the payments exceed the cost of what they're losing to pollution, which in turn is given by MSC minus MC, social marginal cost minus marginal cost. But the charcoal firm will never pay more to buy the air and manufacture charcoal than the price at which they can sell it. It's not worth it to them. These limits, like when the charcoal firm held the rights, will cause the two firms to bargain their way to equilibrium at Q prime. What's important to recognise is that this only works because the market forces each firm to internalise the external damage they're doing. Through opportunity cost, the firm with the property rights is forced to incorporate the social cost as part of their own cost function and adjust accordingly. Because they are able to bargain freely for that which belongs to the other, which firm we assign the rights to has no bearing on the eventual allocation of resources. This outcome is known as the Coase theorem, and like all simple economic theorems, it's contingent on certain conditions within the market. The first is costless bargaining. So the cost of bargaining is included in the social marginal cost curve, which now functions as the MC curve for both firms. The higher the cost of bargaining, the higher the MSC curve will be. If the cost of compensation or reducing output, depending on which side of the bargain you're on, catches up with the opportunity cost of producing as much as you like and not bargaining, then the firms won't reach a deal, and the firms will just produce according to their own original private cost functions. The second is properly defined property rights. This is simple. The two firms cannot bargain for the use of the air if it's not absolutely clear who owns it in the first place. So I can only bargain for something if the person I'm bargaining with owns the goods I desire. There is one other important complication to consider. Just because the market has found an efficient resource allocation, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's found an equitable or a fair one in our eyes. The best way to look at this for economists is back at our graph. So now, at the new level of output, the vertical distance between points A and C represent the cost to the eyeglass firm. The vertical distance between point C and Q prime represent the cost to the charcoal firm. And the distance between A and Q prime represent the sum of both of them together again. At Q prime, the overall social marginal cost is as low as the two profit maximising firms will allow it to go. But we might still take issue with how that cost is divided between the two of them. For the sake of argument, let's suppose that the market has allocated 65% of the cost to the eyeglass firm and the other 35% to the charcoal firm. This is where normative factors come back into play. Now suppose that the eyeglass firm set up its business first. It paid a premium for a location that was free of air pollutants, and let's say it invested heavily in upgrading its machinery. Many people would probably reason that it's not fair that it should bear the lion's share of a cost that it didn't create and couldn't reasonably predict. We could change the situation again. So what if the eyeglass factory was in fact a group of local residents, understandably upset about the external damage to their health or their property values? We might reason that they deserve to pay 0% of the cost, equivalent to the suggestion that the factory shouldn't produce or even exist at all. Or we could reverse the scenario and suppose that in that community, the charcoal factory provides thousands of jobs for those same residents, and it needs to keep production high to provide them with employment. So we can spin the circumstances however we want. All we're really saying is that efficiency is not the same as fairness, and that's something else to consider. So what if in that instance we want to adjust the balance and reduce the output of the polluting firm artificially? What we have to do is find alternative means of forcing firms to internalise the costs of their externalities. So there are a couple of ways of going about this, but we'll focus on economists' favoured solution for various types of externality, and that's via the tax system. This solution was first proposed by A.C. Pigou in the 1920s, and the tax itself takes its name. We call it a Pigovian tax. If we take our original model and suppose that the government implements an excise tax, which is to tax the revenue made on each unit of charcoal the firm sells, in other words, reducing the net price of charcoal, we see that the firm is now producing at a much lower level of output. It will set Q where MC intersects P minus T at point C. The fundamental here again is that profit is maximised where price is equal to marginal cost. P equals MC, or now in this case, where net price equals marginal cost. P minus T equals MC.